So a little while back, this company, DMAX Audio, reaches out to me and says, hey, would you do a review of our SuperCubes 5 Ultra Near-Field monitors? I took a look at these things and I was like, I'm a bass music engineer. I mix on mid-field Neumann KH420 monitors that go down to 26 hertz. Why on earth would I ever mix on these tiny little toasters? Actually, my toaster's bigger than one of these guys. But I looked them up, and when I read a little bit about them, I got curious because they are a sealed box and they're a single driver speaker. There's no bass, mid, treble, tweeter. There's no crossover. They're just one driver that does everything. And I hadn't mixed on speakers like that before. So I said, hey, send me a pair. I figured I probably wouldn't like them, and I could give them to my kid as a toy and he could poke the drivers to death, and that would keep him occupied for a few minutes. But obviously, they're still here in my studio. Want to find out why? Stay tuned. So first off, these are ultra near field monitors, not near fields, ultra near fields. Okay, so what is an ultra near field? An ultra near field speaker is something that you listen to incredibly closely. These ones have a recommended listening distance of 0.8 to 1.2 or 1.4 meters. That's like 2 foot 8 inches, I think, to about 4 feet. So they're very, very, very close. And most monitors, if they're two-way or three-way designs, can't be used that close, because when you have two separate drivers, the distance between the drivers means that they need a bit of time of flight for the signal to sound integrated and merged. And if you go too close to a multi-way driver, then you can actually hear the bass, mid, and treble all separately coming from their separate sources. So these ones, because they are a single driver producing all ranges of frequencies, you can be as close to them as you want, basically, or at least very, very close to them, and it sounds merged because it's all coming from one source. So that's kind of what the design of an ultra near field is. So I get these things, I unpack them, I plug them in, I put them in this room. This is a secondary studio for me. I have a control room with the flush-mounted Neumann KH420s. It's my main studio, but this is an alternative space that I use. I use it sometimes for mixing. I use it for shooting YouTube videos. I use it for doing product reviews, and it's also my fiance's office, and it's also our family's movie theater. So this is this multi-purpose room. There's a lot of acoustical compromises that I had to make to set up this room. If I put any more acoustic treatment in here, my fiance will literally murder me. So I'm kind of maxed out with what I could do. And so I set them up in this room. I was basically prepared to be seriously underwhelmed. And I plug them in. And I fire up this song, and it's a song from one of my favorite artists. He's a friend of mine, Angus Wilson. Shoutouts to Angus Wilson. And he's a singer-songwriter, so it's just him and guitar. So it's this really minimal, stripped-down song. And I throw it on. It's a song I know really well. And I listen, and I had one of these like, oh my God, moments. It's always interesting with product reviews. I've been reviewing speakers for like well over a decade, and it's not often that I'm surprised by something. But I put these on, and really what jumped out at me right from the get-go was their sense of phantom center was like nothing I have ever heard before, and that includes the Neumann KH420s in my control room. They have an amazing phantom center, but it wasn't like this. This was like there was a LCR system, and this was the center speaker, and I was just hearing it come out of my laptop screen. In fact, when I had my fiance listen to these speakers, she swore up and down that my laptop speakers were still on, and that's where the sound was coming from, rather than from two separate sound sources. So their sense of phantom center is just unparalleled. And there's a variety of reasons for that, which we'll get into. But then the other thing is, was there a lot of low end? Well, I wasn't putting on a song that had a lot of low end. So what I was hearing is these beautifully balanced and detailed mids and highs. So again, I evaluate monitor speakers kind of as a big part of what I do. And I've had many studios and many sets of speakers. And aside from the very, very top end, like my KH420s, in terms of the mid and the high performance of these monitors, these were some of the best that I've ever heard. They certainly outperform any two-way monitor that I have ever evaluated, ever. I would prefer the mids and highs. And then when I thought about it a little bit more, I was like, these actually top the flagship Focal monitors that I evaluated a few months ago, the Focal Trio 11Bs. I actually prefer the mid-range and highs of the SuperCubes to the Focals, and they're edging right in on the performance of my Neumanns. One thing I should say right off the bat, of course there's limitations to these. I'm not just going to give them a totally glowing review. There's upsides and downsides, and we'll talk about all of them. One of the downsides is they don't produce much power. They're 50 watts each. Okay, so the amount of SPL, these are not even, I would never use these as main professional monitors. They don't have the frequency response. They don't have the SPL. But if you accept them for what they are, like these are under $1,000 for the pair with the amps. And if you accept them for what they are and you understand their personality, they're nuts. They're totally nuts. Okay, so let's go into some of the things that I would normally talk about when evaluating a monitor. Soundstage and envelopment, okay? You kind of, when you're talking about phantom center and a convincing phantom center, is there a really strong central image? Usually that is inversely proportional to your sense of width and stereo field. And I found that with these. I did not get the same sense of envelopment and stereo width that I get in my control room with my more widely spaced out KH420s. There isn't that sense of stereo width, but there is this incredibly convincing and beautiful phantom center. And of course you can hear width in them. It's just, they're not as wide sounding as other monitors. They don't have as huge of a soundstage. And that's partially to do with one aspect of their personality, which is the fact that one driver is making all of the frequencies. So what that's going to do is wavelength and diaphragm width are related to each other in terms of monitor directionality. So what it means is that the high frequencies are very directional. You do not have a big sweet spot with these. So if you move a little bit off axis with these speakers, you hear almost immediate high frequency roll off. So really, they're designed for a single engineer. If you ever see these in a studio and you see two or more people sitting in front of them, you know that they don't understand how to use the monitors that they're in front of. These are ultra near field monitors designed for one single person. You cannot sit two people side by side and listen to these. But when you have one person and you just stay right in the sweet spot, they're really magical. Okay, so you have to understand the directivity, and that has to do with the soundstage piece. Now, these have aluminum membranes, and they're extremely light, so they get going very fast. So the transient detail, the punchiness, the dynamics that come out of these speakers, very, very, very convincing, very punchy, really, really beautiful transient detail. Okay, so you're getting that sense of transient punch and speed that you don't get from some larger monitors. When you have a larger diaphragm, a larger membrane, and more moving mass, it just doesn't have the same kind of transient performance because there's more mass to get moving. Low end. Okay, let's talk about low end. No, these are not low end monsters. That's going to be impossible with a speaker this size. So the low end was the main part that was really lacking for me. But the low end was there. It is there, and they are flat down to about 50 hertz. There's just not a lot of energy down there. They don't have a lot of SPL, right? So that's why you need to be so close to them. If you're very far away from these, they just don't sound loud enough. That's why you need to be within that 1.2 meter range. So the main difference between these and other like multi-way or ported monitors is the bass reflex port in a ported design extends the low frequency response, right? And that isn't happening with these because these are a sealed box. They have this much more smooth, gradual roll off in the low end. So the feel of these in the low end is actually really smooth. It's really smooth and round. The bottom of kick drums, the bottom of basses actually sounds really, really nice and round, but they don't have the same kind of resonance the resonant support that a bass reflex ported design would have. Okay, so they have their own personality in the low end with these monitors. So how is it possible that these speakers sound so good compared to other speakers in this class or the near field class? It has to do with some sneaky DSP that's been integrated into the amp. So every speaker, as it receives a signal and it begins moving, it has this attack time. The membrane doesn't just start moving at maximum amplitude in a split second. It needs time to get going. And the larger the driver, the larger the moving mass and diaphragm, the longer that time is to get everything moving. Okay? So that's kind of, you can think of it like an attack period. And then after a sharp, say, transient signal stops, the speaker moving mass and membrane take a little while to be able to return to their neutral or zero position. And that is a way of acoustically coloring the sound based on the properties of the speaker. And this is typically something you want to try and address and resolve so that you get the truest sound possible. Well, the way that DMAX has done this is, I think, at the leading edge. What they did is they sent an impulse, so a single sample, all frequencies, through the speakers, and they measured their impulse response. So they could see the exact way that the speaker was coloring the sound. And then they put that into the DSP, kind of like as a convolution kernel. They phase inverted it, and they canceled it out to the greatest extent possible. And the way that they've been able to achieve this, they've been able to deal with things in the frequency domain, and they've been able to deal with things in the time or the phase domain, such that the net result after the DSP is preconditioning the monitor drive signal is very, very, very neutral. So that's a big part, is these have a little brain in them, a DSP brain, that's doing this sneaky, acoustics wizardry that is causing these to sound, I think, more clear than other monitors in the class. Now I want to talk about mounting these. And these are a different size and shape of speaker than you normally see. So one of the issues that I had was these need to be mounted at ear height, right? They need the center of the drivers, because they're producing all the frequencies, need to be right at ear height. That's typically 47 inches off the floor. Well, unfortunately, most speaker stands are designed for speakers that are much taller than these, that are two-way or three-way speakers. And then you put the acoustical axis of that speaker at ear height, and the acoustical axis of a speaker is usually somewhere between the mid-range and the tweeter, okay? So when I went to mount these on my speaker stands, they were way too low. And because they're so directional in the high frequencies, because I was off axis by just 3 or 4 inches, I was losing a good portion of the high end, and they sounded like the speaker was going through a low pass filter. So I actually had to prop my stands up. And I just did that by using patio stones. I used 4 inches of patio stone underneath my stands to prop everything up. They're very massive and rigid, so that worked really well to be able to prop mine up. The other solution maybe would be angling them, so you could have them mounted lower and you could angle them upwards, but it's a bit fussy to do that because you need to get the angle exactly right. You don't want to be off on these because of the beaminess of the high frequencies. And the other reason I don't really ever like monitors that are angled up or down is because they then become very sensitive to you moving forwards and backwards in your mix position, which happens. You naturally move around a bit when you're working. And when you have the monitor drive signal angled, the more you lean forwards and backwards, the more you're gonna be in and out of the sweet spot. So I don't really like angling them. I prefer to put mine on stands. Now, the final consideration when it comes to mounting these is that I found it basically impossible to mount them in a way where they were close enough to me where I didn't get a specular reflection off my desk. Okay, so if you put a mirror between you and the speaker and you trace that mirror backwards on your desk and you can see the speaker, that's a point where you're getting what's called a specular reflection. So the high frequencies and the mids can hit that point, and when you're in that frequency range, you're dealing with ray acoustics. That's how you model everything. So you get what's called a specular reflection, where the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection, and you get comb filtering. And that's one of the number one speaker setup mistakes that happens in a lot of home-based non-professional studios. But in this case, even though I'm aware of it, I can't do anything about it because the way the desk is oriented and the way it has to be between me and the speaker, and because I'm monitoring with these at 1 meter, I'm right in the middle of their recommended distance, it was impossible for me to get rid of that specular reflection. So what I did is I did my best to solve it by placing a heavy felt mat on my desk surface, and that actually did a lot because the comb filtering is primarily in the upper mids and high frequencies. So that actually addressed it, not fully, but addressed it enough for my application. So these are all things to be aware of when you're dealing with a speaker that needs to be this close to you. Factor those things in. So let's wrap this whole thing up and talk about my final thoughts and kind of who I think these are best monitors for. So I think if you're not working on bass-oriented music and you don't need to really nail the low end, or there's not a lot of low end, like synth-driven low end in your music, these are going to be better monitors for you. If you're the type of engineer who's working on a lot of low-end dominant music, these are probably not the right monitors for you. Or if you are using these, you'd really need to rely on headphones or another system like that. And I should mention, a lot of you are probably thinking, well, why can't I just throw a sub under these? That was actually my question to the founder of DMAX. And really, because of the DSP and what the DSP is doing, because there is a bit of latency from the DSP calculations, it's very difficult to integrate a sub with these. Maybe DMAX will make a sub at one point, but right now a sub isn't really going to be a great solution because of the DSP processing that's going on. So you really need to make sure you're monitoring your low end using another monitoring system. So I would not make these my main monitors. These would be secondary monitors. The other thing that these can be really useful for is checking what your mixes are going to sound like on a frequency range restricted system. So originally, the original Oratones kind of came out to simulate what radios sounded like during the day. So these were systems that were range restricted in the frequencies they could produce, and the Oratones really helped to mimic what that was doing. Same thing here. These have a similar kind of range restriction to their frequency response, and they can be very helpful in that regard. So would I make them, professional caliber main studio monitors? No, that's not what these are meant for. That's not what their personality dictates. Would I use these as a secondary set of monitors? Oh yeah, 100%. And in fact, in this room, they are my main monitors, because in this room, it's just a secondary studio for me. And if I'm mixing bass-oriented music or I want to check the low end, I check in my control room on my Neumanns, or I use my headphones. But here, they work great in this room. Now, the other application where these are really good is when you're in a room with acoustic compromises. So I mentioned earlier, this room has a lot of acoustics compromises in it. The room orientation is kind of funky because of the multi-purpose nature of this room. So the fact that these monitors are very directional, and the fact that they're ultra near fields, there's a higher proportion of the direct sound from the monitor in comparison with the room ambience, actually works to my advantage in this particular space, and I really love working on these monitors. Okay, so final thoughts. You just need to take into account the personality of the speaker. It's very directional. It doesn't have a huge amount of low frequency extension. It's not super loud, but for the price point and for what it does do, the incredibly convincing and beautiful phantom center, the detail and the clarity and just the general performance and smoothness and evenness, flatness of the mids and highs is excellent. Their transient detail and the impact of the DSP on the overall frequency response and all of the problems that it solves is really just makes this a top-notch monitor. So I think for the sub $1,000 category, these are most certainly some of the most excellent monitors that I've ever tested. So yeah, that's my review. Hope you enjoyed this one. Hope you learned something. If you haven't subscribed to the channel already, make sure you smash that button, give it a thumbs up, drop a comment, let me know what you thought, and I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.